Okay, so we're going to talk about two main things. We'll start off talking about the electrical activity of the heart, and kind of what the different action potentials look like, a little bit about EKG, and some things related, and then we'll dive into kind of more cardiac cycle, and all the different functions related there. So yeah, so let's start out with that's not working. Yeah, let's start out with talking a little bit about these special cells inside of the heart that are called nodal cells. Okay, so non-contractile cardiac cells, which are really a form of cardiac myocytes, but they are a modified version. And we find these in the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, as well as some other places throughout the ventricles. But their special property is that they depolarize on their own, right? Just kind of like how we talked about in the GI tract last week about those interstitial cells of Cajal. There's a similar idea and similar function to those here. Okay, so they don't really have a resting membrane potential. They don't have a flat part between action potentials. They go down to as far depolarized or as far hyperpolarized or just as polarized as they're going to get, and then they just immediately start depolarizing again. And we can see that, we can see that in these action potentials right here. This is what those action potentials look like. We'll spend a little bit more time dissecting the ion flows related to that. And we've really already spent time with these action potentials a while back when we talked about muscle. That's what the contractile cell action potentials look like, but we'll spend time with these autorhythmic cells here in a minute. Okay, so we've got this kind of setup of the electrical conduction system in the heart. Okay, why don't you guys take a second and just label those things as well as you can. Yeah, so go ahead and do that with the person next to you for a sec, and we'll come back together, make sure we're all on the same page here. You guys see this stuff in the heart at all, really, or no?
Yeah, we did.
Could you actually find some of the some of the nodes and stuff? Cool.
Broke up in the heart, looked at all the papillary muscles and regulated.
Okay. Could you actually see the nodes, like the AV node and the SA node?
No,
not really much to see. Probably not.
No.
Yeah.
Is it that evident?
I don't know. Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
I didn't think so, but I didn't know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, probably not. They're too small. All right, looks like most of you guys have filled in most of that. So let's start up at the top there. So what's our first one called at the top? SA node, sinoatrial node, okay. And then we're going to get down to the next node there. What's that one called? AV node, atrioventricular node, okay. And then we get this part right here. What do we call that part? Bundle of His. There we go. Yeah, so the bundle of His, okay. And then down here, kind of right next to that, before it splits into two, is which part? Yeah, or the common bundle. And then it splits into two, right? So then we've got the branches, right? What do we call those branches? There we go, bundle branches. And then finally, the part that wraps around the heart that conducts much faster than any of the other parts. What do we call those? Yeah, there we go, those Purkinje fibers. Okay, so we got that. Questions on any of those? Okay, all right. So then this conduction pathway is kind of all these structures here. Okay, you can see the locations there. The sinoatrial node serves in all regular conditions as the pacemaker of the heart. Okay, and what is the rhythm that it what is the rate that it depolarizes at? Guys, remember? If we don't control it with the nervous system at all, how fast will it depolarize? How many beats per minute? Yeah, about 100, right? About 100 beats per minute. So what that means is during resting heart rate that we're all in right now, we're having to have active control by the parasympathetic nervous system to slow us down. Okay. The reason that one becomes the pacemaker is mainly because the AV node depolarizes faster than that, or sorry, depolarizes slower than that, right? It's that one's going to, the ASA node's going to happen first, right? It's going to depolarize first and then send the signal down, kick off the AV node as it's in the process of depolarizing, but not quite there yet, right? So that's that. So that one sits right next to the tricuspid valve. Okay, but we do get a slight pause here when the electrical signal hits the AV node. Okay, and it's going to be increased more by acetylcholine release. We'll talk about some of those mechanisms that slow down heart rate here. But that pause is going to be decreased by catecholamines, meaning that we're speeding up heart rate with our sympathetic nervous system, right? Slowing down heart rate with our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, and we've got these other branches here that we just talked about. Again, these Purkinje fibers, since this electrical signal's heading here, we're already causing contraction of these muscle cells, right? So we need this to wrap around super fast so these ones can kind of catch up with the ones that are already starting to contract and build pressure, right? So that's really why we need those Purkinje fibers to send that signal fast, like super duper fast, so we can get that outside of the heart contracting along with the inside where in the septum there. Okay, so that kind of walks us through that. Let's just do a quick review of our cardiac action potentials. Okay, that really, when you say cardiac action potential, we're really talking about the contractile cells. Okay, and so we saw this similar, we saw this same slide before, right? So we have number one here being caused by influx of sodium, right? That's that rapid depolarization. Okay, number two is primarily caused by calcium influx, right? The sodium influx stops, okay, but then calcium starts flowing in to keep us depolarized in that plateau phase, right? And then finally repolarization there by stopping of calcium, but then allowing potassium to leave. Okay, we talked about why that tension builds, right? A lot of that has to do with the calcium rushing in, binding to troponin, getting the extra actin myosin binding along the way. Okay, so when we see the cardiac action potential, if you look at the x-axis here, we're looking at around 250 milliseconds, right? Okay, something like that. Okay, typically when we see the action potential for a skeletal muscle cell or a neuron, the scale on the x-axis is different, right? So it almost looks like maybe it's the same length, but if you put them on the same scale like this, right, then you can see just how much different those two action potentials are, right? If we have the same scale down here out of 300, then we can see that, yeah, this one is tiny, right? This one only lasts about 4 milliseconds, whereas the other one is 250 milliseconds, right? So that plateau phase really changes everything as far as an action potential, right? This is extending the action potential by a great deal of time. Okay, so that's just a little bit of review of cardiac action potentials. This would be skeletal muscle fiber as well as neuron action potentials. Okay, any questions on those before we dive into the next one, those autorhythmic cells? Okay, all right, so the autorhythmic cells, we have kind of 4 different phases of the action potential. Okay, so the first one's called slow depolarization. Okay, this is going to be due to sodium influx. Okay, these channels are called, the channels that allow for this are called funny channels. Strange name, right? Or they're also just known as H channels. Okay, they do allow for sodium and potassium to move, kind of similar to the ones that we saw in the neuromuscular junction, right? But sodium influx dominates over potassium movement, and so we get that depolarization, that slow depolarization. Okay, then at the very end of this slow depolarization phase, well, first of all, this H is called that because this is happening after hyperpolarization. Okay, so this is after the very bottom, the as far polarized as it's going to get. So hyperpolarization right after that, then those H channels open up. So they're known as these like after hyperpolarization channels. Okay, so then we get this right around towards the end of this slow depolarization, we get some calcium influx happening. Okay, via these channels called T-type calcium channels. Okay, and that stands for transient calcium channels. Okay, so we just get a little bit of extra opening there, getting a little bit, pushing us a little bit further towards the action potential threshold, adding to the sodium influx effect that's already happening. Okay, and then we hit the action potential threshold. Okay, and then we get rapid depolarization. Okay, and this is going to be via calcium influx again, but just more of it. Okay, and these are due to L-type calcium channels. And there's like the long lasting, longer, what was what the L stands for. Okay, and then finally at the end, as we move our way back down towards the polarized state, we get repolarization via the same mechanism we do with all the action potentials, potassium efflux. At least that one stays consistent. Okay. So when we look at the graph of what that looks like, right, we can kind of see it over here, right? We can see what's going on here a little bit. These images show you the flow of ions and they're color coded. Okay, we can see those sinoatrial node cells, right? So this would be one of those, or these are those nodal cells right there, and you can see they connect directly to the contractile cells in the atria. Okay, and then we can see those gap junctions between those atrial cells, right? This is what we talked about earlier on. So that signal can just go right from one cell to the next. Okay, so just take a second and kind of fill in what's going on here based on the information I just gave you on the previous slide. Okay, so kind of point an arrow to which part of the line is being caused by which ion flow and which channel type. And we'll come back together in a second. Make sure we're on the same page. Okay, go ahead.
Well, you might, but right.
All right, so let's just briefly talk about that here so we can see that slow depolarization that's happening early on. All right, all of this, which really leads into this too. That's why I kind of circled it around the other circle, but that's sodium influx via those H channels, right? And then at the very end of that slow depolarization, we also add to that calcium influx, right, with the T channels, okay? And then to get that rapid depolarization there, that we see right here, right? Now we're talking about those L channels, okay? And then finally, potassium channels are just allowing potassium to go out to cause repolarization. Okay, questions on any of that? Go ahead, yeah.
The potassium moving, is that also through the H channels? Or do you say
Just potassium channels. Yeah, we'll talk about a couple potassium channel types coming up here. But even at that, we don't necessarily name any distinctly. There are a couple different ones, but yeah, I don't really have the specific names in here. Yeah. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
super quick. So the ion flow and the channel flow that we were just talking about is only in SA node, correct? Like, is it in that next one, right? The contract time, it's a
Yeah.
different pattern.
Different type. Yeah, this is for the contractile cells. We would have this in SA node, AV node,
So just in the
just in these autorhythmic cells. Yeah. So different. These are autorhythmic cells, have this type of action potential. Contractile cells have that type of action potential. Yeah. Go ahead. Say it one more time. Just what I wrote. Potassium out. Yeah. Efflux. Yeah. What else? Other questions on this? Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about some of the mechanisms of modifying heart rate and kind of what this looks like. Okay. So first of all, we'll look at a lot of these words coming up over the next 2 weeks, but chronotropic effects mean that these are effects that affect time. Okay. So chronography, like the time, right? It's talking about time. So anytime you see chronotropic, that means we're affecting heart rate, pretty much is what it is. But specifically means affecting time. But really, in this case, we're changing heart rate, right? So the chronotropic effects of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system we'll talk about here. Okay. So obviously, sympathetic nervous system activity is going to increase our heart rate, right? We know that. Okay. And it's going to do it primarily by increasing both sodium and calcium influx. Okay. We'll talk about all the mechanisms on the next slide. Okay. Which I didn't really intend to write it all out there because you'll see it on the next slide. Okay. But it's going to be messing with multiple channel types of sodium and calcium. Okay. Leading to more influx. And so the one thing I will write here though, is that we increase the slope of depolarization. Okay, so if you look at the slope here versus this, you can see it's steeper, right? That slope steepened, okay, with the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. And that's related to how fast we're allowing sodium and calcium to rush into those sinoatrial node cells. Okay, so that's sympathetic. Again, we'll see some mechanisms on the next slide. Okay, and then parasympathetic activity, we're both changing the slope, so decreasing the slope, and we're also hyperpolarizing. All right, so again, here's our starting slope without vagal stimulation. Here's our slope with vagal stimulation, right? So much flatter, right? Not as steep, but then also we went from only going down that far to going down that far, right? So we started at a more hyperpolarized state, which just means we got further to go to get to the action potential threshold, right? So it's going to take a little bit longer to do that. So we're spreading out these action potentials by doing that. Okay, we're going to also mess with sodium and calcium influx. Okay, but we're going to decrease sodium and calcium influx for primarily instead of increasing. Okay, questions on any of that so far? All right, we're good. Okay, so then these little schematics that I found in an article explain some of these mechanisms in a really nice way. Okay, so we've got those sinoatrial node cells here. Okay, they have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? That's what this is. You can see the ryanodine receptors there that we've talked about before. Okay, and then there's all kinds of different channels. Right, then we can see acetylcholine coming and binding to an acetylcholine receptor, right? That's one of those muscarinic 2 receptors, right? We said M2R, right? Muscarinic 2 receptor, same thing there. Okay, so when acetylcholine comes and binds, kicks off all of these events leading to cyclic AMP, protein kinase A, all of that decreasing, right? And then we get all of these effects here, right? So we get, number one, decreased calcium influx via those L-type channels. Okay, so can we find the L-type channel on there? What color is it? What color, John? Green. Look for calcium with an L next to it. Yellow, right there it is. Yeah, so there it is. So we're decreasing the phosphorylation of those L-type calcium channels, which makes it so less calcium comes in. Okay, well, that's what the P is, decreased P, we're decreasing the phosphorylation of those L-type calcium channels. Okay, so we decrease the influx of calcium. So that's number one. Okay, we can see number 2 here, decrease the sodium influx via those funny channels, which is just the IF. What color is that one on there? Purple, there it is. Okay, there we go. So we're decreasing phosphorylation of that channel, which means it's not as open as it was before. We don't have as many of them open. Okay, this is just showing one, right? But there's a bunch of them. Okay, so we don't have as much sodium influx. Okay, and which part of the action potential did those two affect? Right, we have the L type. Which part did that affect? Which state? Which one? Yeah, so that was the more rapid one, right? So that would be messing with this a little bit, right? Okay, and then the funny channels are going to be messing with this part, right? So we're stretching out this part a little bit here by doing that. Okay, and then it also changes, or also increases potassium efflux. Okay, we got this type of channel here. Find that one on there for me. What color is that one? Now, where is it? Green. Yeah, up there on the top. There's a couple green ones. But yeah, this one up here on the top, right? So we actually are going to increase potassium efflux. Okay. This has a couple effects. It, as we would expect, it increases hyperpolarization, right? So that takes us to this effect, right? Pushing us down a little bit further here than we were before, right? So we start at a more hyperpolarized state. Okay, so we got further to go. But then it also has this interesting effect where it kind of slows the depolarizing effect of these funny channels, right? So if we're allowing potassium to leave at the same time as we're allowing sodium to come in, then that kind of can offset those a little bit, right? So then that changes the slope of that slow depolarization as well. Okay, so that's the parasympathetic side, right? So this is P and S over here, right? Effects of acetylcholine. Okay, questions on those three? Okay, so then let's look at the sympathetic side, right? So sympathetic nervous system here, okay? Pen's messing up. So epinephrine, norepinephrine have very similar effects. It shows them both up here. Okay, we're seeing a beta-1 receptor, beta-1 adrenergic receptor with norepinephrine binding to it. Okay, And the two primary effects here are we're increasing calcium efflux via those L-type channels. Okay. Where's that channel again? Which color? The yellow one down there in the bottom, right? Yeah, so we see calcium L right here. Okay. So now we are increasing phosphorylation of these channels, opening up more of them, having them more open. So we got more calcium influx. Okay. That's going to make our rapid depolarization quicker. But then we're also phosphorylating these funny channels, these IF channels right here more. So we're getting faster. That slow depolarization is getting faster. Right, we're speeding up that slow depolarization, which that would increase the slope like we saw on the previous slide. Okay. All right. Questions on any of that? So we got kind of like 3 mechanisms here, 2 mechanisms over here for kind of how this works. All right. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the ECG. Okay. So how many of you have a lot of experience looking at ECGs, EKGs from doing like putting the pads on and doing it? Yeah, for sure. So quite a few of you. So that's great. And some of you, probably have much more experience than I do in interpreting these. So we're just gonna kind of look at the basic side of this here, and then you'll get into some of the interpretation of all the different ones like this. More in your cardiac class later, cardiac block later, but we'll just kind of do a basic intro of what's going on here first. Okay, so this is a voltage measurement. Okay, anytime we're measuring voltage, that means that we're that's the potential energy in electricity. Okay, meaning like what's the difference between 2 different locations, right? What's that potential difference? Okay, so we're looking at charge difference between 2 locations. Okay, and let's see if we can just label these here. What's this wave called? P wave. What does it represent? Atrial what? Depolarization. Okay. We got this guy here. What do we call that? QRS. What does that one represent? Ventricular depolarization. Okay. And then we've got this one here. What's that one? T wave. And what does that one represent? Yeah, ventricular repolarization. Okay. We don't see atrial repolarization because it's happening right around the same time that the QRS complex is. So it's just kind of hidden by that. Okay. So that's the very basics of that. When we do the measurement, right, this is our typical pad placement for a 12-lead EKG. Okay. There's 2 different groups of electrodes. Okay, so we have our bipolar electrodes and our unipolar electrodes. Okay, so the bipolar electrodes, with bipolar electrodes, we have 2 active electrodes, and these are using our standard limb leads. Okay, so we're going to see we're going to get 3 different views of the heart this way. Okay, so this will be like lead 1, 2, and 3. Okay, in a second we'll see which combination of these pads are used for each 1, 2, and 3. Okay, you don't see 1, 2, and 3 on there because we're talking about 2 pads together, and the line between them, that's what the lead actually is, right? But the key differences there, we have 2 active electrodes, 2 electrodes we can name. It's those 2 that are the ones we're looking at. Okay, with unipolar recording, it uses what's called an active electrode, but then also what's called an indifferent electrode. Okay. And so with this, we have 3 unipolar limb leads. That's AVR, AVL, and AVF. Okay. Again, you don't have the names. Those aren't the same names as the pads, right? Because we're talking about a lead, a spot between 2. Okay. And then there's these 6 unipolar chest leads, and those do correspond with the name of the pads as well. Okay. And so we'll talk about what this means to have this indifferent electrode there in a second. Okay. So yeah, so here's a little bit about the different angles, right? So each lead that we look at looks at the heart from a different angle. Okay, and so it kind of looks at a different part of the heart, looks at either the front of the heart, the side of the heart, the back of the heart. Okay. And so it's used to detect issues in different anatomical locations of the heart. Okay, and this image is just kind of showing that to you, which angle each of these is viewing the heart from. Okay, so here is the same kind of idea, but actually showing us what each of those 12 lead views would look like. Okay, as you can see, sometimes the QRS complex is upright, like we're used to seeing it. But then if we go to the other side of the heart, it flips over, right? It's upside down, right? And so that's just all based on the direction of flow of ions in the electrical current that's passing from one lead to the next. Okay, so depolarization moving towards an active electrode produces a positive wave, one going upwards, but then depolarization kind of moving away from the active electrode is going to make that negative wave. Okay, and again, you'll get into all of this in much more detail in your cardiac block, trying to interpret each one, kind of knowing the anatomical location that each of these look at. But that's beyond the scope of what we have time for in this class. And I'll just be honest, I don't know that stuff either. I'm not a not a clinician in that way. So, okay. All right, so let's look specifically at the limb leads here. Okay, so these are the bipolar limb leads. Okay, so we can see lead 1, lead 2, and lead 3. All right, so you can see that lead 1 is created by that right arm pad connecting to the left arm pad. Right, so we have 2 active electrodes there, and then you can see 2 and 3 are created by using that left leg lead along with either of the arm leads. Okay, and this triangle is called Einthoven's triangle. Okay. All right. Yeah, so that's kind of the basics of what we're going to look at for this. And what we'll do next is just kind of look at some. So, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is a lead? Will you?
Yeah, good question. So the lead is a connection between 2 pads. Okay, whereas a pad is just the pad, right? So when we look at yeah, let's look at this one here. So this one is kind of showing where that indifferent lead shows up, and I didn't really explain that as we were walking through, but pretty much the indifferent lead is going to be taking a couple of leads, kind of creating like a false spot where there's actually not a pad, but then connecting that to one of those V pads, right? And so that's really what it is. Whereas with the limb leads, we actually have so like this one here, we've actually got pads here, right? And so the lead is the connection between those 2, right? That's our lead. Okay, those are easier to interpret because it's just literally just 2 pads connecting to each other. Those are the bipolar leads. But then as this is saying here with these unipolar recordings, this indifferent electrode is kind of like, it's almost like an imaginary electrode, right? It's not actually there. So it's the effects of, it's pretty much constructed by the pads on the arms. And so it's the interaction of the electricity passing through where those intersect, kind of creating this false spot here. And then that connects to these V leads pretty much.
When you
Yeah.
say that they're connecting, let me know. I mean, I can Google this too.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not
no.
specialist in cardiology.
Yeah,
But
do my best.
when they're connecting,
Yeah.
does that mean they're like, literally sharing like a electrical pathway?
Yeah, so this is what this is what voltage is, right? Is voltage is looking at the different, if we're looking at lead 1, which would be between these 2, we're looking at the difference in charge between this point and this point, right? And so when we go from the right arm to the left arm, let's look at that here, right? This side is more negative, this side is more positive, and in that case where it's showing that. And so pretty much that's gonna, if we have this upward wave shown when the potential moves towards the positive side. So if we have electrical activity being greater towards the positive side, then that's gonna make a wave going upwards, right? When we have electrical activity going the other direction, passing from more electrical activity going to the left, so there from positive to negative, then that creates that negatively pointed wave. So, yeah. And it's much easier to kind of envision with this Einthoven triangle versus these guys, because we're kind of just creating this point by finding this intersection between these 2 limb leads, and that's that kind of indifferent electrode there in the middle, and then that's that indifferent electrode And then we're looking at the difference between that spot in the middle and then each of those V pads that we place on the body. So yeah, that's my best explanation. Yeah, good. Okay. Other questions on this? Okay. All right. Well, let's just look kind of briefly at these very somewhat common EKG strips here. Okay. And really this is just kind of a matching type thing. You can talk with the person next to you for a second, see which one you think is which, and then answer this question here. We'll just come back together and decide what you think. Enough of you have enough experience with this that you can probably pick up most of these. Okay. So go ahead, take a sec there. Yeah.
Is it measuring the like electrical signal of like the entire heart or just like the top?
It's really just kind of catching the top part of
That's
it there.
what I'm saying, okay.
And this is kind of catching the apex over here. This
Yeah.
is, yeah, so that's,
Okay, that makes sense. So
Mhm.
then, is it like just looking at like the nodes like right here or like they're just?
yeah, good question. I don't know specifically like what anatomically exactly we're looking
Okay,
at
yeah,
with
'cause
that, with
it's
lead one, but
That looks like.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, you guys you'll get more detail with your cardiac class, I'm sure, but
Okay. It's
yeah.
extracts, you know, these like signals and like making a graph of it.
Yep,
It's
exactly.
not like an indirect, like catching like the light or something and then.
No, it's
No.
it's picking up electrical activity for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, charge difference between the 2 points.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay, so let's start off with the third one there. Atrial fibrillation. Which one did you guys think that one was? D. Yeah. Yeah, so we've got a clear QRS complex, but then we have this kind of sporadic activity between the QRS complexes. So that's pretty much those atria just kind of fluttering, what they're called, right? They're kind of just like fluttering, not doing much. We'll hear more about this condition here in just a sec in the presentation. Okay, so that one's AFib. What about ventricular tachycardia? Which one did you guys think that one was? C, right? And that one still has a larger QRS complex, kind of. It's not necessarily, it doesn't look like a typical QRS, but it's still larger, right? Versus B, which was which one? Yeah, so that's VFib. Which one are you most afraid of? VFib, for sure. That's known as the death rhythm there, right? Yeah. Which one would sorry, I can't talk and write at the same time. Which one would a defibrillator shock for? B and C for sure, right? Yeah, definitely VFib, VTAC. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then these two here, the only difference is really just that distance between the QRS complexes, right? So which one did you think was normal sinus rhythm? E, right? Yeah, and then a slower bradycardic rate was the last one there, which was A. Okay. And then obviously, what do we call the opposite of bradycardia? Tachycardia, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Any questions or comments about any of those? Any war stories anybody wants to share? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
What's fibrillation? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, so it's kind of this sporadic activity passing through the sinoatrial node, where it's just like sending way too many depolarizations too rapidly, and all those heart muscle cells don't really have time to have much relaxation between, so they're kind of just quivering, they're kind of contracting, not even together really, and so we don't get a nice strong contraction of the atria, which isn't too big of an issue. Well, maybe we're gonna hear more about this hopefully, but yeah. Yeah, let's hold that. Yeah, I won't say too much more, but yeah.
Why? This, the death rhythm.
Because you don't get any blood pressure with it, right? There's no time for filling. Okay. And so we don't, the ventricles are doing the same thing. They're just kind of quivering, right? They're kind of contracting, sending out just little spurts of blood, but there's not enough time in between beats for the heart to fill up. Right. And so our cardiac output is just plummeting massively, right? Because we don't have any filling time. We don't have a strong beat that's all in synchrony. And so, yeah, we just don't have any blood going to the brain, don't have any blood going to our vital organs. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay, so then lastly here with EKG, before we move over to the presentation in a short break, is just some basic looks at myocardial infarction and what that would look like in an EKG. Okay, so heart attack here. This A column is normal. Okay, so if we're making our way up A, that's normal. Okay, the main thing we're looking at is ST segment, either elevation or depression. Right, so ST being between the QRS complex and that T wave, right? So if we look over at B, that's kind of like immediately after the infarction happened, okay? And we can see this rapid rise in certain views of that ST segment, right? So we're seeing ST segment elevation, okay? And this is really happening early on here, okay? So we see the mechanism there for causing that early phase ST segment elevation is rapid repolarization, which is caused by increased potassium channel opening. Okay, so this is kind of happening seconds after the artery gets blocked. Okay, so those cells are lacking oxygen. That's leading to some mechanism involved in that. That's leading to extra and more rapid opening of potassium channels. Okay, and that is seen as that ST segment elevation. Okay, because we're getting this rapid repolarization. So our heart cells are depolarizing, but then they're repolarizing much quicker than they normally do because we have extra opening of potassium channels. Okay, so that's kind of the first one. A little bit further on, we see decreased resting membrane potential, okay, which can look like TQ segment depression, which then is really manifested as ST segment elevation. Okay, the main mechanism there is due to loss of potassium to the extracellular space. Okay, so when you think about heart cells actually dying, right? Cardiac myocytes dying because they don't get enough oxygen, they break open, right? And when they break open, they dump out everything that's inside of them, okay? And we know the primary ion of the intracellular space is potassium, right? So we get all this extra potassium kind of being dumped out into the extracellular space around the heart cells, okay? And that leads to this hyperpolarized state of the cells that are still there, right? So the cells that are still intact. So we get this decreased resting membrane potential in that area, and that is manifested as segment elevation as well. That's happening kind of later on, maybe minutes or so. It says down there in the very small print how much later this is happening. But then even further than that, this we get also see some ST segment elevation later on in the timeline here, and that can be due to delayed depolarization, and this is just a direct connection due to this lower resting membrane potential. Okay, so overall, again, with those cells that are left, we have this we have this lower resting membrane potential, which then just takes longer for all of those heart cells to depolarize, and that kind of angle, that longer angle that it can take, can also make it look like ST segment elevation too. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of that as well. And again, this is totally looking, some of these are ST segment elevation looks like it's going down actually instead of up, right? Whereas other ones are going upwards. And again, that's dependent on which view of the heart we're looking at and actually where the damage on the heart is. Okay. All right. Well, let's take a short break here, probably about 10 minutes. We'll get the presentation set up, and we'll move into that. So let's start the presentation right at about 10:30. All right, let's go ahead and talk through this in terms of we'll just do it as the pathway of blood. So we got blood entering in. Ooh, I don't know why it zoomed in like that. We got blood entering in the big vena cava, right? So we got superior vena cava, we got inferior. Okay, those are going to dump into which chamber? Right, atrium. Okay, and then we got to get through this valve here to get to the next one. What's that valve called? Tricuspid. Okay, that's going to lead us down to obviously the right ventricle. Okay, that right ventricle is going to contract, send blood up through this valve here. What's that one called? Pulmonary valve. Okay, and then out this big vessel here. What do we call that big vessel? Pulmonary trunk, and then splits into pulmonary arteries, right? Pulmonary trunk. Okay, and then it's going to go to the lungs, fill up with oxygen, come back via these vessels here, the ones we were just talking about. What do we call those guys? Pulmonary veins. Okay, obviously into which chamber? Left atrium. Okay, and then we got to get through this valve here. Is that one? Mitral valve or the bicuspid. Okay, down obviously to the left ventricle. Okay, that's going to contract, send blood through that valve, the aortic valve. Okay, so that kind of just walks us through our pathway, those big vessels there. Sure, you guys could add a lot more structures along the way. That's what we'll start with for this class. Pericardium. Okay, we've talked about a little bit about serous membranes, right? Serous membranes are these membranes that have two layers with a cavity in the middle, fluid-filled cavity in the middle. Okay, so this is a nice close-up of it here. We can see what's called the fibrous pericardium. first, right? And then we have the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So that serous membrane is the part where we start having those two layers. So the parietal side is the one further away from the organ that it's surrounding, right? Then we have the cavity that would be fluid filled, right? And then we have our epicardium, which is also the visceral side of the serous membrane there. Okay, and then we move down into the myocardium, right? Just the heart layer of the muscle. And then finally the endocardium, which is really just endothelial tissue lining the interior chambers of the heart. Okay, pericarditis is when we inflame this membrane, right? We inflame this pericardium in one way or another. Okay, pericarditis is that infection that leads to that. It can be fatal, right? And this can be really just a cause of a common virus that somehow makes its way into your heart, right? It can be other causes as well. But if that fluid expands too much in that pericardial space, then it just starts smashing down on the heart, leading to cardiac tamponade, which is really just this rapid beating of the heart trying to fight against that pressure, which can crush cardiac output eventually, right? And so this is just showing removing some of that extra fluid from that pericardial space to take the pressure off of the heart in an emergent situation like that. So you better know your anatomy pretty well if you're sticking a needle into somebody's chest like that, right? So yeah, so I'm sure most of the time now it would be done via ultrasound. But yeah, that's somewhat of a new way to do things, right? So I just can't imagine sticking a giant needle into someone's heart while their heart's moving around a lot, right? It's yeah, got to really know what you're doing. So yeah, any questions or comments on any of that? Okay. All right, so let's kind of review some of these terms that we're going to be diving into here as far as the cardiac measurements go. Okay, so EDV, what's that one stand for? And so end diastolic volume. All right, so this is at the very end of rest. How much blood do we have in the heart, right? We're really talking about the left ventricle for the most part when we're doing this. You could do it on the right side as well, but most time we're talking about the left ventricle. Okay, so that's as full as it's going to get, right? That's as much blood we're going to get into the heart before it starts contracting and releasing some of that. Okay, end systolic, or yeah, ESV is end systolic volume. Right, so this is the blood left over in the left ventricle after we've emptied as much as we're going to empty for that beat. Okay, so then what's our equation for stroke volume? SV is stroke volume. What's our equation for it? How do we calculate it? Say a little louder, John. What was the okay? What was the operator between the two of them? Somebody else can help John out. What do we got? What's our equation? There we go. We're gonna, how much blood did we start with? And then subtract how much blood we still had. Sorry, I can't talk that well. And right, let me try that again. Okay. Subtract what's left over after the beat. Right? It's the same idea as like we've got a glass of water, right? We want to know how much we poured out, but we just poured it on the ground. So we can't really measure how much we poured on the ground, right? So we know how much we started with, we pour some out, and then we measure how much we got left over. The difference between those two is how much came out, right? That's what stroke volume is, right? How much we started with, how much is left over. Difference there is what came out. Okay, so next we got ejection fraction. All right, so ejection fraction is going to be, does anybody know the equation for this one? This is pretty much like a percentage. So the percentage of blood that came out of the heart. What would, anybody remember this equation? So we want to start with what came out of the heart, which is stroke volume, and then divide that by what we started with, which would be EDV. Right, so we take what came out, which is stroke volume, divide that by what we started with, which would be end diastolic volume, and that's going to give us a fraction, like a decimal, right? So usually we need to multiply that by 100% to put this into percentage format. Okay, so those are definitely things you're going to need to, those equations you're going to need to know and be able to calculate. And then we have these three factors that dictate stroke volume. Okay, what would we, how would somebody describe preload? We want to take a stab at that? Preload, what is that? Say it again, Chairman. Yeah, good. So it's really how much kind of stretch we get on the left ventricle before contraction. And so what would be a good measure of this? So measured by end diastolic volume, right? Because that's how much blood we get in. That's what stretches out the heart, right? So end diastolic volume. Let me make some more room here. And this is going to be kind of the stretch on the left ventricle before contraction. Okay, what about afterload? Who wants to go ahead, Andrew? Yeah.
What the concept that is, like, how
Of
that-
preload. Preload's a concept, really. So it's not a measurement, but we measure it by end diastolic volume. And so that's going to be the primary way that we measure it. Yeah. What about afterload? Who wants to take a stab at that one? Afterload, anybody? Okay, so we got afterload would be the pressure that needs to be overcome to open the aortic valve. Okay, so how much pressure do we need to create by the left ventricle to open up that aortic valve? That's afterload. Okay, so any guesses on what we would use to measure this one? How could we quantify that pressure on the other side of the aortic valve? Blood pressure, absolutely. And the best way to do it is just what's called mean arterial pressure, which is our average blood pressure, right? It's kind of the average of diastolic and systolic blood pressure together, mean arterial pressure. Okay, so afterload and preload are not opposites to each other. They're not, they're not reciprocals of each other. They're different concepts, but a lot of times that's easy to think that they would kind of be the opposite of each other. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
You guys know why I'm here? Did they explain that?
Yeah, they did. They did,
Okay.
for sure. Yeah.
Sometimes people get so confused, they're like, why is it a camera?
Yeah. No, Robert told us. Yeah, for sure.
I work
Yeah.
for the marketing department.
Yeah.
Just
Awesome.
Two things I want to say. There is no audio being captured here, so say whatever you want. Even if you see the camera pointing at you while you're talking, no one's gonna hear you. That's like first thing. Second thing, if you do see the camera pointing at you, just keep doing exactly what you're doing. The worst thing you can do is wave to the camera. It makes the video completely unnatural. And I can't ever use that footage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wave your mom.
Just two disclaimers, like two quick notes, but other than that, please learn how to
Perfect.
say people.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay. Then our third concept that's going to dictate stroke volume, because all these three factors really are dictating our stroke volume. Third one's contractility. So who wants to take a stab at that one? How would you define that one? There we go. Force of contraction. That's it for sure. Force of contraction. Okay. And anybody remember how we measure it, how we quantify it? This one's ejection fraction, right? So that ejection fraction we were just talking about is the way that we would measure this, because the harder our heart contracts, the higher percentage of that blood that we started with is going to come out. Okay, so those are our three factors that dictate stroke volume. We'll dive into those in a little bit. Okay, and then cardiac output. This is just the amount of blood coming out of the heart every minute. But what would be our equation for that one? How do we calculate cardiac output? You guys remember? There we go. So cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Perfect. Yeah, cool. Okay, so any questions about these terms and these volumes or measurements before we keep going here? Go ahead, Olivia. Yeah, so the pressure, I just have P for pressure that needs to be overcome to open up the aortic valve, pretty much, right? So we're picturing like pressure on the other side of the aortic valve in the aorta. In order to open up that valve and push blood, we have to have more pressure inside the ventricle than we do outside, right? And so that pressure we're trying to overcome is afterload. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the cardiac cycle here. And this website, you should have these. I think the links are still active on the PDF. Is that something you guys can click on? You don't have to necessarily do it right now. I just want to see for the future because it has a lot of resources. Good. But let's take a quick look at it as we walk through the cardiac cycle here. Okay, this is just the first part of it, but there's all kinds of different things you can look at on this website. So it is pretty helpful, and there's a lot of little animations and stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to walk through a couple things here. Okay, so let's start up here. Oh, I can't draw on that. Can I do anything with that? No, let me see. That's true. That would be smart. It can also just need, all I really need is a pointer, but that's not working. Here, I'll point this way. Yeah, so we're starting here with atrial systole. The atria haven't contracted yet, right? Our blood is filling in from the vena cava, right? And at that point, the atria are pretty much just acting like big blood vessels, right? They're just our valves here, our tricuspid and our mitral valves are just open, right? So the atria are just letting blood just flow right through them, right? And so that's kind of a big piece to understand here. It's not like we're filling up the atria, we contract it and then fill up the ventricles. That's not what's happening, right? The atria are just acting like big blood vessels to start with, right? So we're filling up the ventricles here. And then we move into what's called isovolumetric contraction, right? So the ventricles contract. That immediately leads to the closure of our mitral valve and our tricuspid valve, okay? But we don't have any blood ejecting yet, right? Because we haven't exceeded afterload yet, right? That's why that aortic valve will not open until the ventricle creates a greater pressure than what we have over here on the other side, which is the afterload, okay? So then once the ventricle exceeds that pressure, then we move into ejection. Right, so now the ventricles create enough pressure. We open up the aortic valve, blood's leaving now, right? And then here, the ventricles are starting to relax, right? And so now the pressure in the ventricles is actually less than the pressure in the aorta again. So the blood just makes a U-turn and comes right back towards the aortic valve, right? And that's what's going to snap shut this aortic valve here. Yeah, and so that's what we see. And then finally, now at that point, all the time that these two valves were closed, the atria were filling, right? Because blood was still coming back in our vena cava, even though our ventricles were contracting. So now, as soon as this pressures drop enough in the ventricle for those pressures to be less than the pressure up higher in the atria, which is when the ventricles can relax, then all that blood that was filling up in the atria just can drop down into the ventricles. Okay, so that's kind of our primary steps in the cardiac cycle, and that'll kind of set us up for talking about the Wiggers diagram here in just a sec. But any questions about what we just talked about there? I know. I guess Robert took me seriously. Yeah, I was joking about that, Robert. I was not. I know it's making me sweat a little bit. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So that kind of walks us through this. This image walks us through that cycle as well. But I just wanted to show you that website. Yeah. Yeah.
Are closing the aortic and pulmonary valve.
Yeah, totally. So we will yeah, we'll get to that, but pretty much let's see if we can get to the point on this diagram. Yeah, see, I don't like this diagram as much. Let's go back to the other one. So here this is when the aortic valve and pulmonary valves are open, right? So ventricles contracting, creating a bunch of pressure, blood's ejecting. But then here we're moving towards relaxation, right? The ventricles are starting to relax. They still have pressure in them, but then as soon as that pressure gets lower than the pressure in these big vessels, blood just makes a U-turn, right? And it comes right back to the heart. And that's what snaps the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve shut. Yeah. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so let's kind of walk through this Wiggers diagram. We'll watch this video here to explain it. But we got we're going to work through this Wiggers diagram for a while. That this thing here is a time aligned view of the top part is the ECG, right? The middle part is kind of a bunch of different pressures in the heart. And then we see a line there for the heart sounds with S1 and S2. And then below that is the volume curve of the left ventricle. Okay, and all of that's time aligned. You can also see the kind of pictures of what's going on in the heart at the same time. It's one of the most helpful tools for understanding cardiac pressures, cardiac physiology. So we'll spend some time with it here. Okay, yeah, so let's go ahead and watch this little video, and then we can go from there. Okay, and here's what I want to do. We'll come back to looking at some of these questions here and the stuff on this slide. But what I want you to do first is use this one that has all these kind of fill-in things and fill in as much as you can there. Okay, and so depending on when you downloaded the PDF, I might have added this to it. But that's pretty much saying the circles are valve events, meaning that a valve is either opening or closing. Okay, and our two options are either we're really talking about the left side of the heart, so it's either the mitral valve opening and closing or the aortic valve opening and closing. Okay, so you got 4 circles there to fill in. Okay, and then you've got the kind of small squares. We'll talk about these central venous pressure waves or atrial pressure waves later, so don't worry too much about those. But then the rectangles are just labeling the lines, okay? And we've got the labels of the lines right here as well, okay? So you can look at those labels there. But the big thing we're looking at here, these are the heart sounds, right? And then the circles are really what I want you to try to focus in on, right? So when our ventricular pressure exceeds our aortic pressure, what kind of valve event would be happening there, right? So that's kind of what you're walking through. Spend a couple minutes with that right now, see how much of that you can fill in, and then we'll come back together and see where we're at and keep going. Okay, so go ahead, see how much of that you can fill in with those circles and then those rectangles as well. Work with somebody on this too. It'd probably be helpful to talk it through.
No, this is okay. This one is just a circle. Yeah.
Yeah, so you probably want to label the lines first with those rectangles. That's probably your best bet, and then move on to the circles.
If you're coming to schools and rectangles, whether you're kind of be
They were counting to prepare, but maybe they're closed until like halfway through. I think they're so fine. They're still closed because then think about it. If it's closed, like fluid's been on that. The fire is so.
All right, so I helped you out with labeling those lines there. If you want to look at that, make sure you're got the same idea. Or aortic pressure, yeah. So P for pressure.
Yeah. What are the little boxes?
The little tiny ones.
Yeah.
Those are events in the atrial pressure wave that we haven't really talked about yet, but they're on the previous slide. It's also known as central venous pressure. That's why it says CVP waves. Okay, let's go ahead and come back together here. And let's walk through what's going on here. So let's not worry about the CVP wave yet, the central venous pressure wave, which is also known as the atrial pressure wave. Let's not worry about that yet, okay? As far as the little boxes labeling that, we'll come back to that in a sec, but let's just talk about the aortic pressure, which is this one, right? That's our aortic pressure. So that's the pressure. That's really our afterload, right? That's the pressure outside the aortic valve, the afterload we were just talking about. And then we have the ventricular pressure, that's solid line, okay? So let's start in A, right? So A is our atrial systole. Okay, so we see that's happening right after our P wave, right? So that makes sense. Atrial systole is showing up right after the P wave. So the P wave's depolarization there. And that is going to be pretty much the last bit of filling that the heart does, right? See the volume going up just a little bit there at the end, right? The heart's already pretty full, but we get what's called the atrial kick, right? Just that last bit of blood that was in the left atrium gets pushed down into the left ventricle. And so that's what we see there, okay? So you see a little bit of filling there, okay? And then we move into B, isovolumetric contraction. That was one we were talking about before, right? So the ventricles start to contract here, but we don't have enough pressure to actually eject blood from the heart, right? So it's isovolumetric, volume staying the same, okay? So we see ventricular pressure starting to rise, right? So we see that rise in ventricular pressure, but as soon as that happens, right, the immediate thing that happens is a valve event right here, right? Which valve are we talking about right here? Which one? Mitral or aortic? Mitral, right? This is where those papillary muscles you guys looked at in lab come into play, right? Because we contract the ventricles, that just makes blood go up, right? So it's going to hit the bottom of the mitral valve. It's also going to hit the bottom of the aortic valve, okay? So I always like to think of the mitral valve as like an umbrella, right? When you think of like an umbrella, if it gets too much wind up underneath it, it flips inside out, right? That's exactly what would happen to that mitral valve if our papillary muscles didn't contract and pull down on that mitral valve, right? Because all of a sudden we got a bunch of pressure up underneath that mitral valve, and so those papillary muscles pull down. We're holding all that pressure there, right? Which just pretty much makes blood go the other way over to the aorta, right? Over to the aortic valve instead. Okay, that one's still going to stay closed as well. So but that first event is going to be closing of the mitral valve, right? So if I could zoom in there, yeah, it's too hard probably, but yeah, so we'll say mitral closes, MC. Okay, but then we're still building pressure, right? Ventricular pressure is rising as we're getting more of that heart muscle to contract. And then right here, we see the ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure. So what's going on there? What valve event is happening there? Which valve, first of all, aortic or mitral? Aortic, and what does it do? Opens, right? So aortic opens, okay? Because we just exceeded our afterload, right? That's what we did. We created more pressure than what was there on the other side of the aortic valve. Okay, so then this whole period C and D is all ejection, right? So rapid ejection and reduced ejection. Okay, so we can see C and D, and we can match that up with volume too, right? Volume is leaving the heart at that point, right? So we're losing volume in the heart because it's dropping. Okay, and then volume or pressure is dropping. Right here, it drops below the pressure in the aorta, right? So what's going to happen there? Which valve? Aortic is going to do what? Close, right? Absolutely. Aortic valve closes. Okay, that corresponds with S2, right? We see S2 on this one. Okay, that corresponds with S2. S2 is the snapping shut of the aortic valve, right? This is what I was talking about before. Blood's leaving the aorta, and all of a sudden it just makes a U-turn and comes right back, right? And snaps that aortic valve shut. Okay, that's our second heart sound, S2. Okay, now our ventricular pressure is dropping, still dropping. Okay, our volume is staying the same throughout that whole point, right? We're not getting any more blood in the ventricle yet. But once we get this volume low enough to drop below our atrial pressure, right? We were building some atrial pressure here because blood's been filling the atria as we've been contracting the ventricles, right? So atrial pressure is rising, but once ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure, which valve are we talking about there then? Mitral again, and what does it do? It opens up. All right, so all that blood that had filled up the atria, now it just all dumps into the ventricles. So we get this rapid filling phase, right? Because there was a bunch of blood already in the atria waiting to just fall down into the ventricles. So we get all of that rushes into the ventricles, fills it up for a good chunk of it. Okay, so that's our rapid ventricular filling phase, right? Then we get to the kind of reduced ventricular filling phase, where it's just blood kind of flowing through the atria now, doing the last bit of the filling, until finally we get to the very end there, atrial contraction again. We get that atrial kick, fill up the ventricle to the end. Okay, questions on those waves first. We'll come back to the atrial one here in a sec, but questions on that? Yeah, no. Yeah, so since we're looking at the left ventricular volume here, we're talking about the mitral valve, but we could easily do the same thing on the right side of the heart too, for sure.
But like in general, if it didn't specify left or right, like this could be like wherever there's mitral, that's where it's tricuspid.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Our pressure wave would be a lot different there, right? We wouldn't get up to 120 millimeters of mercury on the right side of the heart, right? That's only left side of the heart. But yeah, we could do the same thing for that side too, for sure. Yeah, good question. Other questions on that? Okay, so then let's go back here to the previous slide and look at this part here with the left atrial pressure. Okay, so atrial pressure wave on this one is the blue one. Okay, so we can see a few different waves here. So what's called the A wave is the pressure generated when the left atrium contracts during the P wave of the EKG. Okay, so let's look back, and we would put our A wave right here, right? That first little box, right? We see that bump in pressure. That's because the atria just contracted, right? So we get a little extra pressure in the atria there because the atria contracted. Okay, so that's our first, that little tiny square, that's the A wave, okay? All right, so that was this one. The C wave is during the onset of ventricular systole, okay, due to the mitral valve moving up into the left atrium, right? That was what I was just talking about with the air coming, or the wind coming up underneath your umbrella. Same thing with the blood rushing up underneath the mitral valve when the ventricles contract. That makes the mitral valve push into the atria a little bit, right? And it creates a little pressure wave. Okay, so we can see that right here, right? So that one was called the C wave. Okay, so that's the C wave. The mitral valve kind of just stretching up into the left atrium a little bit when the ventricles contract. Okay, and then our last one there The V wave, late systole during the T wave, this is the increase in pressure due to the filling of the left atrium, right? Like I said, that since the mitral valve's closed, but blood's rushing back anyways, we're slowly filling up that mitral or that left atrium, right? And so that pressure is rising here, right? And that one, what was that one called again? The V wave, yeah. So this one here is called the V wave. As that left atrium is filling, we're getting more and more pressure in there. Eventually it's going to overcome the ventricular pressure and then cause the mitral valve to open up. Okay. Questions on that one? Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, the C wave is, so it's happening right after the QRS complex, right? We're seeing that. We're seeing ventricular pressure rising here. Once it rises enough, again, that's just pushing blood up. If we look at this image here, yeah, so we're pretty much just slamming blood up against the backside of the mitral valve right there, right? So when blood hits the backside of the mitral valve, it just kind of flexes up this direction a little bit, right? It kind of pushes up into it, and that creates some pressure in the left atrium. Yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, let's just talk briefly about the heart sounds to make sure we're there. Okay, so S1 is due to closing of those AV valves, right? That happens right when our ventricles contract, right? Because that's what caused the blood rush up underneath those AV valves, snap them shut. Okay, so this is during ventricular contraction. Okay, so what's the real function of those valves? The function of those valves is to keep the blood from going back into the atria, right? When we contract the ventricles, it stops the blood from going back into the atria. Okay, so stop backflow into the atria. Okay, and then S2 is due to the closing of the semilunar valves, right? Again, that was when the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in those big vessels, so in the aorta or in the pulmonary trunk, right? Blood makes a U-turn, comes right back to those valves, snaps them shut. That's S2, okay? So this is going to be happening during relaxation of the ventricles. And so the semilunar valve function is to keep blood from backflowing into the ventricles, right? Stop backflow into ventricles. Okay. Questions on that? So we've got a couple things here. We dealt with the pressure waves of the ventricle and the aorta, pressure waves of the atria down here. Obviously dealt with the EKG, talked about the heart sounds. We'll talk a little bit more about the volume here in a second, so we can actually calculate stroke volume from that volume curve there. But other questions so far? Go ahead. Yeah. Going back where? No, yeah. There's no valve there. It's really just a gravity and pressure thing, right? We don't really fill the atria except during ventricular contraction, right? The rest of the time those the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, right? So we're not filling too much. But yeah, when you lay down, that I mean changes some pressure dynamics in your heart, but gravity definitely helps keep it going the right direction for sure. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at a couple things here. I have more here than we have time to do. Okay, but I found this really cool article in there's a journal that's all about advances in physiology education that I read, and this has a whole article on how to teach with the Wiggers diagram, and they have all these things, and that's linked right here. Okay. And so it has all these cool little like worksheets. I included most of these, but we don't have time to do all of these. And I kind of figured that would be the case. But that they're here for you and that to do. Okay. So this one, but I do want to walk through this one with you. Okay. but we'll talk about a few of them along the way. But let's do this one here. So we can use the volume portion of that fill-in diagram, the black and white one, the one that we were just working on, to first of all determine what EDV is, what's ESV, calculate stroke volume from that, and then you can calculate ejection fraction from that. And then if I tell you the heart rate's 60, then you can also calculate cardiac output. Okay, so go ahead and do that with the people around you. You're using this diagram here, right? We got our volume right here. We can see it's as full as it gets, as empty as it gets, right? And you can work from there. Okay, so go ahead and try to do those calculations. We'll come back together in a minute or so. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. Looks like most of you are pretty close with that. Okay, so what did it look like end diastolic volume was? Yeah, about 120. Okay. So 120 mils. Okay. And then how much was left over after contraction? About 40. Okay. So then our stroke volume, 120 minus 40. What's that? 80. Okay. So 80 mils is our stroke volume. Okay. And then to get ejection fraction, we got to take our stroke volume, divide by end diastolic volume. Okay. So we got 80 divided by 120, right? And then we times that by 100%. What did that number give us? 67. Yeah. So about 2/3, right? Yeah. So 67%. Okay. So typical like ejection fractions are somewhere around 60, right? When we get heart failure patients can get into the 20s, even below 20. That's when we're moving towards transplant when it gets below 20%. Yeah. So we got about 67% there. Okay. And then if our heart rate's 60, we just got to take our stroke volume times heart rate. So 60 times 80 there, right? What do we get from that? What was it? 4,800? Is that what it is? Yeah, 4,800. Yeah, but we typically don't say, we don't express cardiac output in mils per minute, right? So it's always going to be expressed in liters per minute. So then what would that be? 4.8. Okay, good. Just want you to know how to do those calculations, be able to do it from the Wiggers diagram there, because you've got the volume curve there to show you that. Yeah.
67%
Uh-huh.
that one plus subtract 67% of the volume.
Perfect. Got it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what else? Other questions on that? Go ahead. 60-ish, yeah, like somewhere around 60 is pretty normal. Yeah, that changes when you start exercising, it goes up. You can definitely have, yeah, in the 50s is not necessarily bad, but like a normal, healthy young person heart, we're looking for somewhere around 60-65%. Yeah. But that definitely declines with age, for sure. So, yeah. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so yeah, so a lot of these again are just practice that I think will be really helpful for you to work with. So this would be just like drawing your own ventricular volume curve. If your end diastolic volume is 135 and systolic volume 65, you can just use that as studying, as practicing. This one here is you've already got your aortic pressure curve, but you don't have the ventricular pressure curve, right? So you're kind of drawing that in where it should be, seeing the phases there, can be just a good tool to help you learn that. Okay. This is another practice one. You're just labeling those valve events like we already have. Okay. And then kind of the causes of the heart sounds. Okay. So all just good things to study with. And then here you're drawing in the EKG strip based on kind of putting it where it should go, right? So again, just things to help you study. This one here is definitely more complicated. I don't plan on testing you on this, but again, this one is just helpful. But the article there has answers to all of these. If you are interested in diving into that deeper, you can, but we just don't really have time in the next hour to go through all of these. If we have some time afterwards, then when we're done with the notes, then we can come back here. But I wouldn't have this kind of pressure volume loop on the exam, but it is really helpful in understanding all of it if you work through all those questions and yeah, and work your way through it. Okay. All right. Any other questions on that so far? Okay. All right. Do we want to, well, let's do this here, and then we'll take maybe just a 5-minute bathroom break, stretch break. Okay. So heart murmurs are, kind of these abnormal heart sounds that you can hear. And the basic ones we'll talk about here are caused either by stenosis or regurgitation. Okay. So stenosis really just means that a valve is stiff and it's hard to open up. Okay, so the heart has a harder time opening those valves when it should. So then blood kind of like squeezes through and can kind of make a sound with that. Okay, and so when we have aortic or pulmonary stenosis, that would be heard during. Yeah, and it's probably best for you guys to talk about this a little bit, right? So let me just set that up, and then let's see what you guys can do with talking about it. So again, stenosis means the valve is stiff, and so we have a hard time opening the valve. Okay, regurgitation means the valve isn't working well, and when it's supposed to be stopping backflow, it's not stopping backflow, right? So blood's kind of coming back and hitting it, and then a little bit of it's like squeezing through. Okay, and so yeah, talk about with that in mind. Talk about that for a second and see. So we're really just saying, like, would this be heard during ventricular systole or ventricular diastole? That's really the main thing that you're filling in here with each of these. Okay. Talk about that for a sec. See if you can work through that. We'll come back.
Yeah. I was thinking.
After the blood goes, you're supposed to go out. Yeah, like blood is getting like blood.
Yeah, right.
All right, let's come back together and see what you guys thought here. Okay, so aortic / pulmonary valve stenosis. So that is when we're trying to open up those valves, but it's hard to open them up. And so some blood is kind of squirting through, but not fully getting through normally. So what would that be heard during systole or diastole? Good, right? Because those valves are opening when we're contracting the ventricle. So perfect, that's systole, okay. Aortic or pulmonary regurgitation, this will be when the blood is coming back and hitting those valves and shutting those valves. Supposed to be shutting them, but they're not shutting all the way. So is this systole or diastole? Diastole, good. Okay, now with our AV valves, right, our atrioventricular valves, when we have stenosis of those, this is when we're trying to open those up. So when are we trying to open those valves up? Is it during systole or diastole? Yeah, diastole, right? Good, because that is when diastole, because the ventricles are relaxing, which decreases the pressure in there enough to be below the pressure in the atria, so we can open up those valves and drop the blood down. Okay, and then we're trying to close those valves when the heart contracts, right? So the last one is systole as well. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh. There's more abnormal sounds than just these. These are just two kind of simple ones to cover here. But yeah, that is where it kind of depends on, I think, where you're listening and stuff like that. But yeah, again, I'm not a clinician in that way, so I don't know exactly how that works. But there is definitely a location to it, where you're listening, where you're hearing it. But yeah, I don't know a lot about that. Yeah, so. Okay, let's take just a 5-minute stretch break, bathroom break. We'll start back up again at 11:40 and we'll keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna dive into something called what's called the Fick principle. Okay, and the Fick principle is really telling us that oxygen consumption, which is called VO2, is dependent on two things. And the things we've just been talking about are cardiac output. And then the second one is called AVO2 difference. And we'll talk about what that one is here in a sec. But really, cardiac output is representing our oxygen delivery, right? Because this is how much blood we're sending out. Okay. And then that AVO2 difference is representing how much oxygen our cells or our tissues are demanding from the blood, how much oxygen is being extracted from the blood. Okay, so this is really, looking at the whole purpose of the cardiovascular system, which is to deliver blood. Obviously, we'll pump it, to carry it, deliver it, and then that oxygen in the blood to be extracted when it gets to the tissues. Okay, and so when we're looking at overall oxygen consumption, that's this idea of VO2, right? Volume of oxygen, okay, is dependent on cardiac output. Again, that's the delivery part, and O2 demand. That's this thing called AVO2 difference. And so the A there stands for arterial, the V stands for venous. So what we're looking at is really the difference in the amount of oxygen in the blood from when it was on the artery side versus when it's on the venous side, right? And the difference between those two is going to be how much oxygen was extracted when it went through the capillary beds, right? So if we're thinking about an artery, coming in over here. That's a very straight artery. Sorry about that. And then we got a capillary bed there. And then we got veins here, right? So this is artery. This is veins, right? If we come in with 100 mils of oxygen over here, end up with only 80 mils of oxygen over here, that means we extracted 80 mils of or 20 mils of oxygen, and that would be our AVO2 difference. Yeah. Oh yeah, and sure, we're talking about the whole body here, right? So this is just looking at our total difference between arterial oxygen supply or concentration and venous oxygen concentration. So yeah, but in general, that's the normal setup, is just that one set of capillary beds. Yeah. Yeah. But even in those portal systems, the first capillary bed is where we're dropping off oxygen, right? And then that second capillary bed always has another function, whether it's to pick up nutrients and drop them off at the liver, right? Or like in the hypothalamus would be to pick up hormones and drop them off somewhere. But still in the first capillary bed of all those portal systems, we're still dropping off oxygen, right? Yeah. Okay, so those are the two things there. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Is the 20 assuming that went to the tissues, or is it like, yeah, it's not like it was lost in the.
Yeah, that's assuming that was diffused out of the red blood cell, went through the interstitial space, got into whatever cells are in this tissue that we're talking about, got used in the mitochondria.
Is there a certain number of percentage that it's supposed to be, or is it?
I just made up numbers right there, but the resting AVO2 difference is normally around 4 or 5 mils, and then that can go up to like around 20 when we're at maximal exercise. So yeah. Just, yeah, it's 20, yeah. Yeah, good question. Other questions on those? Okay, so what we're going to spend some time doing is kind of dissecting these components to see how does heart rate change when we're increasing our oxygen consumption, how does stroke volume change when we're increasing our oxygen consumption. And yeah, we won't really talk too much about the AVO2 difference one, because we're really just talking about the cardiovascular side of things. But that's what we'll do. Okay, so let's start with our heart rate. Okay, so our heart rate is controlled by 3 factors, right? We've already been talking about these factors. Okay, so that's going to be our parasympathetic nervous system, right? And our sympathetic nervous system, but that breaks down into 2 parts. Breaks down into the neuron part of that, and then the neuroendocrine part. Okay, so our heart rate is going to be directly proportional to the intensity of the exercise that we're doing. Okay, it's going to have a nice linear relationship with exercise intensity. And so as we're increasing heart rate to increase our oxygen consumption, we're going to be decreasing our PNS activity first, right? Because we said that, well, normally our resting heart rate is maybe around 50 or 60, right? Maybe somewhere between 60 and 80, okay, for a lot of people. So then to get up to that 100 beats per minute that our sinoatrial node controls our heart rate at, all we're doing is removing parasympathetic activity, right? We're decreasing vagal nerve tone pretty much. So we're decreasing that. Then to get it up above 100, now we have to kick in both of these, right? So we're increasing the neuron activity, which we'll talk about that one, what that is in a sec. And then we're increasing the neuroendocrine side as well. Okay, so the big, the nerve involved on the parasympathetic side, that's going to be releasing the acetylcholine that we're talking about back here. Let me just go back real quick to connect this. We were talking here, right? Acetylcholine, right? That's a neurotransmitter that was released by a certain nerve, right? We got norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter that was released by a certain nerve, right? And then we got epinephrine. That's the neuroendocrine part of this, right? It was released by the adrenal medulla, but then made its way to these cells in the heart. Okay, so let's go back there. What is the nerve on the parasympathetic side? Vagus, there we go. What's the nerve on the sympathetic side? Yeah, they're called the cardiac accelerator nerves. Okay, and then the neuroendocrine side, again, like I just said, we got the adrenal medulla. Going to be releasing both norepinephrine and epinephrine. But as we already talked about, when we talked about the endocrine system, we know that it's primarily this one that is released. Okay, so those are really our three things that are going to help us increase our heart rate from rest up to maximal rate. Okay, questions on that so far? And we know the mechanisms, right? We know that the vagus nerve is going to release acetylcholine, right? We know that's going to have those three effects that we already talked about: hyperpolarization, changing the slope of that depolarization line, right? We know that norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to be changing the calcium and sodium influx like we just talked about. Okay. All right. So then there is kind of an order to things, as I've been kind of alluding to, right? So from 60 or from whatever our resting is up to 100 beats per minute, because this is the sinoatrial node rate, right? That's just going to be removing. So removal of parasympathetic tone, that would look like decreased frequency of action potentials on the vagus nerve, right? We're just slowing down the stimulation on the vagus nerve. So we get less and less acetylcholine release until we're not really releasing much at all. Okay, that would raise our heart rate up to about 100. To get up to about 60 to 70% of our max, this can be primarily driven by the cardiac accelerator nerves, increasing their release of their neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. Okay, but then to get it up above that, we definitely need the epinephrine and norepinephrine released from the adrenal medulla to make our heart rate get all the way up to max. Okay, so that's really the basics of how our heart rate increases. Okay, so that's one side of the cardiac output equation, right? Questions on that at all? Okay, so that's the heart rate part. And then the stroke volume part. We've already talked about these three kind of conceptual factors that dictate our stroke volume. So preload, afterload, and contractility. So we're going to talk about each of those and how those can change to increase our cardiac output and increase our stroke volume first. Okay, so preload, again, is kind of the initial stretch on the heart, right? And kind of how much, that green's not the best color, huh? Let me go back to red. Yeah, so that's really how much stretch we're putting on the heart and how much we're filling it up, right? And what did we say was a good measure of it? Everybody? EDV, yeah, end diastolic volume, right? It's how much volume is in the heart before we contract. Okay. And our big determinant of this is how much blood's coming back in those vena cava, right? That's what it is. So this is called venous return. Okay, so how much blood do we have rushing back through the vena cava, dumping into the atria, is going to dictate our preload, which is measured by end diastolic volume. Okay, so the factors that control our venous return. Venous return is controlled by a couple of factors. Number one, the big thing to think about here is that there's very little pressure on the venous side of our vascular system. Right? We had all the pressure created by our heart, right? That's the origination point of the pressure that's maintained by our arteries, but those arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to capillaries that just fit one single red blood cell through at a time, right? And there's no pressure. We can't have pressure in the capillaries that would just burst them, right? So by the time we get over the venous side, our pressure is gone, right? We don't have any pressure. So we have to come up with different ways to get the blood back. And so you can see a couple of those here. Number one is called the muscle pump. Okay, so we got veins that are between our muscles. We got veins between our skin and our muscles, between our bones and our muscles, just all over the place, right? So every time we contract our muscles, it smashes down veins and creates pressure in those veins. Okay, and then because we have one-way valves in the veins, that makes sure the blood is going one direction. Otherwise, it would just squirt both ways, right? And it wouldn't really help us that much. But since we got valves, it's going to hit against that valve and go the right direction. Okay, so our muscle pump. We also have what's called a respiratory pump. So that's when we take a deep breath that increases our thoracic pressure as well as our abdominal pressure and smashes down our great vessels inside of our thoracic cavity, right? Those big vena cava, big other large vessels emptying from our major organs in our thoracic and abdominal cavities, and that's going to create some pressure and push blood back towards the heart too. Got to have the one-way valves, or else these pumping mechanisms wouldn't really help us that much. Okay. The other big one, another one here that's related, is called the pulse wave. Right, you guys saw, you've seen in your dissection time that we've got those neurovascular bundles all through the body, right? We got arteries and veins traveling right next to each other, right? So we have this kind of situation where an artery gets stretched because of the pressure created by the heart, and it actually stretches out the walls of that artery a little bit. That's your pulse, right? That's what you're feeling when you feel the pulse, is that stretch. And since it's right next to a vein, it smashes down on that vein a little bit, right? And creates a little bit of pressure every time the artery pumps. It creates a little pressure in the vein and pushes a little bit of blood in the right direction. Okay, so that's our pulse wave. And then lastly, our sympathetic nervous system is going to lead to vasoconstriction. And mobilization of the blood pool. Okay, so about somewhere around 60% of our blood at rest is just kind of sitting on the venous side of our vascular system. And so when we activate our sympathetic nervous system, we can constrict those veins a little bit, and then that helps mobilize all that blood that's just kind of being pooled out there, sends it back to our general circulation. Now we've got more blood coming back to the heart. Okay, so all of these factors, at least these two and these two, are all going to increase when we start exercising, right? We're going to increase our muscle pump because we're contracting more muscle. Increase our respiratory pump because we're breathing harder and breathing more, right? Increase our pulse wave because our pulse goes up. And increase vasoconstriction because we're activating our sympathetic nervous system when we start exercising. So all of that's going to lead to an increased venous return, which increases our preload, increases our end diastolic volume, and gives us more stroke volume. Yeah.
That's one way valves, down like all of them.
All through the veins. Yeah. Venous side. We don't have them on the arterial side, but on the venous side, we also have them in our lymphatic system too. Yeah. We'll talk more about blood vessels next time too. Sure. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. All right, so second factor related to our stroke volume is our afterload. Okay, so we already said afterload is the pressure to open the aortic valve. All right, how much pressure do we have to overcome? It's kind of showing there with that like clamp on the end of the aorta, right? And we already said what determined our afterload would be our blood pressure. And then we said average blood pressure or mean arterial pressure is a good measure of that. And there's some different equations that will land you at the same spot for mean arterial pressure. But the one I like the best because it helps you understand it the best is you just take 2/3 times your diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 times your systolic blood pressure. And that gets you mean arterial pressure. That's just pretty much saying that your heart spends about 2/3 of the time relaxing and about 1/3 of the time contracting, right? So, because our blood pressure is much higher when our heart's contracting, lower when it's not, right? So we're kind of averaging the two, but there's more time spent at rest than there is at contraction. Yeah.
We need to measure map.
Yeah, I would know that equation. Yeah. Okay. So this is afterload, and this applies directly to the Wiggers diagram that we were just spending time with, right? Afterload is really shown by this, right? By that aortic pressure. That's our afterload. Okay, we have to overcome that dotted line with that red line there to open up the aortic valve. Okay, so what happens when we have high afterload? Okay, so like hypertension. Right? When you got high blood pressure, that changes the line to something like this. Right? So we pretty much open up our aortic valve a little bit later. Right? I'm sorry, we open it up later, right? Because instead of it opening here, it's opening here now. And then it's going to close sooner, right? Because we're going to go dip below that aortic pressure sooner because the aortic pressure is higher, right? So aortic valve opening comes later. Aortic valve closing comes sooner. So then our total time that the aortic valve is open is less, right? So what would that do to our stroke volume with higher afterload? Decrease, right? So it's going to decrease stroke volume. So this is what your heart has to deal with all the time if you have hypertension, right? Just a little bit higher afterload. So then your heart has a couple options. It can either beat more times, right? It can speed up the heart rate to maintain cardiac output, or it can increase contractility, the one we haven't talked about yet, heart contract harder, right? But if you're always increasing contractility, then the heart starts to adapt to that, right? And starts thickening the walls. And this leads to heart failure, right? This leads to cardiomyopathy, where those heart walls are starting to close in on the chamber. But during exercise, we have to increase our blood pressure a lot. We get our blood pressure up to 160 systolic when we're exercising, but the diastolic doesn't change much. So that also increases our afterload. So this is just kind of a necessary thing, but it does kind of fight against our increase in stroke volume a bit, right? It makes it harder to open up the aortic valve. But we couldn't move our blood fast enough if we didn't have high blood pressure during exercise, right? So this one isn't necessarily making it easier to produce stroke volume here just on the afterload side, but the other two overcome it. Preload and contractility kind of overcome it. Okay, last one, contractility. Okay, we'll talk about inotropic effects. So things affecting contraction or force of contraction are called inotropic effects. Okay, so contractility is force of contraction. And what determines our contractility is our sympathetic nervous system activity. And what was it that was a good measure of it? How did we quantify contractility? Does remember? Somebody said it, ejection fraction, because it's the percentage of the blood that's coming out is really a sign of how hard it contracted. Right? The harder we contract, the more blood that we started with is going to come out. Okay, so go ahead, Andrew. Yeah, you're good. Yeah, so those are just things affecting force, whereas chronotropy are things that affect time. Inotropy are things that affect force. Yeah. And we'll also talk about lusitropy next time. And maybe there's one more I'm not remembering right now, but lusitropy is affecting the relaxation of the heart. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so other factors affecting contractility, right? So as our heart rate increases, this kind of primes our ventricles for contraction just by leading to more intracellular calcium that's just kind of there, okay? Which is going to lead to a higher contractility because we have more calcium interacting with troponin, more actin-myosin binding occurring, okay? So that's just going to lead to more myosin heads contributing to the force of contraction, okay? And then the catecholamines, this is the sympathetic nervous system, right? These are driven by beta-1 adrenergic receptors. These are G protein couple receptors, that same chain of events we've seen before. But the bottom line is it leads to that calcium influx, which has a positive inotropic effect, meaning that we just get more force out of contraction. But that's the same mechanism we already talked about, right? If we go back to that same slide that talked about how we increase heart rate, epinephrine and norepinephrine led to increase in calcium influx. It's the same mechanism. So it's speeding up heart rate, but it's also causing a stronger contraction. Okay, caffeine is an interesting one. It inhibits the breakdown of cyclic AMP. That's one of its primary effects. And if we go back to the mechanism here on the early slides, right, we can see cyclic AMP is a key mediator in this process of leading to increased calcium influx. And that's just going to eventually break down if we don't have as much stimulation of it via more epinephrine and norepinephrine being released. So calcium pretty much blocks the cyclic AMP being broken down, or not calcium, caffeine, which then continually leads to more calcium influx. Okay, yeah. And then another drug that you'll see for sure is called digitalis, which has its action by inhibiting the sodium-potassium pump, which then leads to less calcium removal via the sodium-calcium exchanger, which then leads to inotropy as well. Let me show you that one too, because you can see that on this same image we were working with before. Okay, so we can see the sodium-calcium exchanger somewhere. Let me just find it again. Where is it? Yeah, it's this one right here. Yeah, sodium-calcium exchange is pretty much leading to getting more sodium out. But if we're blocking the sodium-potassium pump, then that's slowing down the ability of our sodium-calcium exchanger because it's leaving less sodium available to exchange, pretty much, right? So then we end up having more calcium staying in the heart cells, which leads to a greater contractility. Yeah, Valerie? It's more like a pump. Yeah, more like a, yeah, I think it's probably ATP driven, but yeah.
But it's separate from other pumps that are involved.
Separate from the sodium potassium pump, and not the same as those other channels that just passively let ions through. Yeah. But yeah, digitalis is a common drug for people in heart failure. Yeah.
If you just gave like straight up calcium, would that also just increase inotropic effect because there would be more calcium that would be going into the cells?
I don't think so unless there was a calcium shortage for some reason. Yeah, that would be my guess, but I don't know for sure. But unless there was already some kind of calcium problem, then maybe increasing calcium would help. But I think it's pretty tightly controlled. Intracellular calcium is pretty tightly controlled. And we always have so much of it available in the bone if we need to, right? And that becomes the priority, is our heart function and muscle function over bone health. So we'll typically always pull calcium from bone if we need it. Okay, yeah, so that's that one. And then we already talked about acetylcholine having that negative inotropic effect. Really, we didn't necessarily talk about it, but we talked about it decreasing the amount of calcium influx. So you could see why that would have that negative inotropy effect. If we don't have as much calcium influx, then that would lead to not as forceful of contractions of the heart. Okay, questions on that? All right, so we got preload, afterload, contractility. And here's what we're going to do for just a minute to kind of put together how these factors change and which of them change in which direction to increase our cardiac output. Okay, so pretty much I'm giving you resting values of all these numbers we've been talking about, and then maximal values of all these numbers we've been talking about. Okay, so pretty much I want you to look at how they change with each, kind of connect them to the factors we just talked about, which ones are showing the preload increase, which ones are showing that a change in afterload, a change in contractility, right? And then we're kind of seeing how that can contribute to this, really, because this is our bottom line. This is what we're trying to do, is increase cardiac output, right? So which of the factors are increasing? Some of them we'll see are decreasing to help us do that, right? So you'll need to calculate a few things, like mean arterial pressure will need to be calculated, but the other ones you pretty much have, okay? And so then you're kind of using this. This is looking at heart rate versus cardiac output. We're seeing that we have this linear increase in cardiac output all the way up to maximal exercise, and it's based on these numbers changing. Okay, so just kind of look at those numbers, and then over here you're just writing in, does it go up, does it go down, and then how does that affect each one? Okay, so go ahead and work on that for a second, and then we'll come back together and go through it.
And that
Huh?
shows up like that.
Oh, yeah, your end systolic is decreasing.
Yeah.
Exactly what are you asking for, like which factor?
So yeah, you pretty much just put in, saying which way each of those things go up or down. And
So
then
like
just-
stroke volume increases if.
Yeah, stroke volume, stroke volume increases, and is that due to EDV going up or down? Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
due to ESV going up or down? Yeah.
Sounds right.
Mhm. Yeah, they should. Yeah, kind of two classes mixed together though, right? These
All
ones,
these ones
these
are
ones are,
X's, yeah.
and then, but then this one we're doing right here is from Bio 1040.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and then the last one's actually from the advanced exhibits class in the MSK, the heart failure ones.
oh, really?
You don't remember that though?
Several things.
What's that?
How many different classes do you teach 7 days?
3 in the fall, so
Oh, wow.
AMP, XPhys, and this one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times there's so much crossover with all this stuff, you know.
Yeah.
I get confused what we've already talked about in each class. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look here. So really the only one you had to calculate would have been mean arterial pressure. Who did that? Who calculated mean arterial pressure? Or maybe never mind. It's calculated for me. I guess what I'm saying here is, yeah, I do have something in my notes, but yeah, this is pretty much 120 over 80 to give you that 94, and then this one is 160 over 75, just to kind of give you the perspective of what that blood pressure would actually look like. Right. So even though we increased by like 40 millimeters of mercury on the systolic side, a lot of times we will decrease diastolic some, and it results in an increase in afterload or in mean arterial pressure for sure, but maybe not as much as we would expect because of that decrease in diastolic. Okay. All right. So then let's look here. So we can just kind of walk through. Obviously, our heart rate's going to go up, right? And the reason it goes up is for all those factors we talked about. We decrease our parasympathetic, we increase our cardiac accelerator nerve activity, increase epinephrine and norepinephrine release from the adrenal medulla. Okay, obviously our stroke volume's going up, as you can see by those numbers there, right? From 70 to 140, it doubles. Okay, which way did our end diastolic volume go, up or down? Yeah, it went up, went from about 120 to about 160. So we get about 40 more mils of blood in the left ventricle before contraction. All right, so we got kind of like a plus 40 here. And then in systolic, which way did that one go? Down, right? Yeah, so we left 50 mils of blood in the heart at rest, but we're only leaving 20 mils of blood in the heart at maximal exercise. But that's actually pretty impressive, right? Because we started with more too, right? This means obviously we can get stroke volume, only 70 stroke volume there, and then much higher there of 140. But we started with more and we ended up with less, and that really reflects our ejection fraction, right? Getting about 60% out at rest, but then getting close to 88% out at maximal exercise. Okay, so our ESV went down. Okay, that's just the big factors underneath stroke volume. But then when we look at preload, afterload contractility, right? Preload obviously went up because we already said end diastolic volume went up. Afterload, which way does it go? Up or down? Which way? Yeah, it goes up, right? Because our mean arterial pressure went up. But again, that kind of that kind of fights against our increase in stroke volume a little bit, right? This is the one that has an inverse relationship with stroke volume instead of a direct relationship. But obviously our stroke volume is not going down when we're exercising. It's just that the other two have to kind of make up for this, right? Okay, and then we've got contractility. According to ejection fraction, it went up, right? 58 to almost 88. So it went up because ejection fraction went up. We can also kind of see that contractility went up by the change in ESV, right? Again, it went down. Okay. Questions on any of those? Yeah, Andrew? Stroke volume. Stroke volume. So it doesn't actually decrease stroke volume. So don't think that, but that one's going in since these are our three factors that dictate stroke volume, right? Preload goes up, contractility goes up, afterload goes up, but that has an inverse relationship with stroke volume, right? Preload has a direct relationship. As preload goes up, stroke volume goes up. As contractility goes up, stroke volume goes up. But as afterload goes up, stroke volume actually goes down because it's harder to open up that aortic valve, right? We have less time of that aortic valve being open. But obviously during exercise, our stroke volume is going up. So it's just that these two pretty much, override the increase in afterload. But we got to have that increase in afterload because that also means we have higher blood pressure and we can move blood around the body quicker, right? So we need that to happen. Yeah, Quinn? Why? Say that one more time. Yeah. We didn't necessarily make that connection. I didn't even really get into it, but there's something called Starling's law of the heart, which pretty much shows that as we fill up the left ventricle more, there's really like three primary mechanisms that make your heart actually contract a little bit harder because of that more blood. Number one is that the heart's elastic. So the more we stretch it out, the harder it bounces back. Okay. Number two is that just like when we talked about with muscle, the muscle has like the length tension relationship, right? When we kind of have our sarcomeres in the right length, we have maximal overlap of actin and myosin. The same thing happens in the heart. When we stretch it out a little bit, we get maximal myosin actin overlap. And the third one is just by stretching out those sarcomeres, it actually makes troponin more likely to bind to calcium. And so all three of those things contribute to actually the heart pumping a little bit harder when it has more blood in it. But that's not even what I mentioned with contractility is primarily controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, right? So by epinephrine and norepinephrine causing more calcium influx. I took that part out of the notes because it was too much, but you asked for it. Yeah, Olivia. Yeah. That should give you the 94, and then the 160 over 75 should give you the 103. Yeah, I just had that in my notes. I think that's right. I didn't try to actually calculate it, but if you take 1/3 times 160 and add that to 2/3 times 75, I think that gives you 103. Say it again. Yeah, if I made you calculate mean arterial pressure, then I would give you 160 over 75, tell you like systolic is 160, diastolic 75. And you just know that you times the systolic by 1/3, diastolic by 2/3, and add those together. Yeah. EDV and ESV are giving us, those are what we need to calculate stroke volume, but not blood pressure. So, yeah. Yeah, good. Other questions? Okay, so let's just talk briefly about heart failure, and we'll finish up with this. Okay, so the definition of heart failure is that when the heart is incapable of maintaining cardiac output, right? Cardiac output adequate to meet the demands of the body. Okay, heart failure is a very debilitating disease as well as a very high mortality rate. within 5 years of diagnosis, there's a 50% mortality rate. So it means 1 in 2 people will die within 5 years of being diagnosed with heart failure. Okay, it's responsible for about a third of the deaths in the U.S. That are attributed to cardiovascular disease. By the age of 40, you got about a 20% chance of having heart failure in the U.S. So it's a large swath of our population. Major healthcare costs. Okay, and there are multiple causes. Okay, valve problems can definitely lead to this, because if valves aren't functioning properly, then that means that's just like fighting against the heart's job, right? The heart's job is to get blood out, right? But if the valves are letting that blood kind of come back in, then that decreases our cardiac output, right? We don't get as much blood coming out. Or it could be stenosis too, right? That's making it hard to open up the valves, so the heart has to work harder to do that. Okay, atherosclerosis for sure. So after a heart attack, if you have now a chunk of the heart tissue that's dead, not helping contribute to the force production anymore, that means the rest of the heart has to work harder to do that. We get some remodeling of the heart. We'll look at what that remodeling looks like, but it leads to heart failure. And then chronic hypertension. We've kind of already talked about this with high afterload. The heart has to just constantly work too hard. That causes remodeling. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
I'm assuming exercise lowers your chances of heart failure.
Absolutely.
So in my mind, it's like, yeah, your heart's working, you got a stronger heart.
Mhm.
Then on the flip side of that, if you have too strong a heart, then you have like the myopic issue where now your heart is too fat.
Yeah,
Muscular.
it's a great question.
So yeah, where does the exercise play into that? Like,
Yeah.
what about exercise?
It's a great question. Pretty much it's this idea that your heart is going to adapt specifically to whatever demand we put on it, right? So the demand with hypertension is just to fight against a little bit more afterload, but not actually need more cardiac output, right? It's just to maintain cardiac output, fight against that little extra afterload. So the likely and the logical adaptation for that is just make the heart walls stronger, right? We don't actually need more room in the chamber, because we don't need to get more blood out. We just need to maintain the amount of blood we're getting out. So the adaptation is thickening the walls without making the chamber bigger. But with the exercise, we are fighting against the higher afterload when we're exercising. We need to get more blood out. But we also have a big time increased metabolism, so we need to send more oxygen out too. So the adaptation is thickening the heart walls, but also opening up the chamber too. So that's we get about a 20 to 30% larger chamber with increases in with endurance exercise. And so it's kind of specifically adapting to the demand we're putting on it, which is not just increased afterload, but also increased metabolism. So we need to get more blood out too. Other questions on that? Yeah, Chairman. Yeah, it can decrease for sure. Yep. But there is, to your question too, Andrew, there is evidence to show that ultra marathon runners, that level of endurance running is not good for the heart. Yeah, there's pretty strong evidence to show that level of stress, even people that run many marathons over their life, is not good for the heart. But definitely once you get into the ultra marathon level of like 70, 100, 150 miles, like that level of stress is damaging the heart for sure. Yeah. So there's always too much. We can always do too much as well, but yeah, for sure. Okay, so this part's kind of interesting because we can see the way that the body tries to compensate for a lack of cardiac output, right? So heart failure leads to a decrease in mean arterial pressure, that thing we're just talking about, right? Because that's really what the heart does, is it creates blood pressure for us, right? So if we don't have a strong enough pump, we have a decrease in mean arterial pressure. Okay, so then we got all these things that the body tries to do to counteract that increase in decrease in mean arterial pressure. Number one, this is a stressful situation for the body, right? So it activates our sympathetic nervous system, releases more epinephrine, more norepinephrine, which is going to cause vasoconstriction, which is going to increase our contractility so we can pump harder. Okay, but eventually, for over many years of high levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine binding to the heart, that leads to toxicity of the myocardial tissue. Your heart isn't designed to always have increased sympathetic nervous system activity, right? So that leads to toxicity. But also this activates the system, one of the systems we already talked about, that renin angiotensin aldosterone system, right? When we don't have enough fluid getting to our kidneys, remember that led to renin release, right? Activated the formation of angiotensin 2, right? Angiotensin 2 is a strong vasoconstrictor as well, right? But also causes us to hold on to fluid too, right? So we're holding on to fluid, we're vasoconstricting our blood vessels, okay? Also that decrease in blood flow to the kidneys. Yeah, so we're doing that there. We get all of that ADH release. Okay, so we're holding on to a bunch of fluid. Okay, water retention. If you've worked with heart failure patients, then you know they're all on diuretics, right? Right, they're all on diuretics because they're trying to shed this extra fluid. Because all that extra fluid, all that does is then it puts more stress on the heart, right? Because now we're stressing out the heart more by filling it too much because we have so much extra fluid on board. But you can see why the body's trying to do it, because it doesn't have enough blood flow overall. So the mechanism is to just add more fluid to the vascular system, right? So these compensatory mechanisms are really just, they're helping in the short term, but really hurting the heart in the long term. So all of this eventually leads to the ventricles completely remodeling, trying to deal with that extra stress. And then it looks like this, right? So remodeling starts as part of an effort to increase cardiac output. And it actually does help us with that at first, right? But eventually the heart cells completely remodel, the ventricle gets loose and floppy, right? Especially if there's been an infarct to lead to this, that part gets very loose. And then the rest of it has to get really thick to try to compensate for that. So yeah, that's pretty much what heart failure looks like. That's mostly systolic heart failure. The other side of heart failure is diastolic heart failure, which is pretty much that the heart can't relax enough, so we can't fill it up. Right? We can't get enough, our end diastolic volume drops, and that's called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, or HFpEF. Is when we can't relax our heart enough, and so we can't fill it up. So there's two sides of heart failure. Okay, we're done. Have a great rest of your day, guys. We will see you next week. Good luck on the rest of your stuff this week. Do you want to say something? Real quick?
Thing, but I just want you guys to be in the loop on Friday. So we're doing a College of Health Sciences trunk or treat, which is like for kids.